In life, we often encounter people who present one version of themselves while hiding another. These individuals rely on charm, confusion, or subtle emotional tactics to maintain control and power over others. But something powerful happens the moment you begin to truly understand their patterns, when you see past the facade and recognize the manipulation for what it is. The dynamic shifts, and not in their favor. Suddenly, the power they held seems small, their strategies transparent, and their confidence shaken. Manipulation rarely starts with something obvious. It begins quietly, in the subtle gray areas of communication, where people use charm, selective honesty, and emotional appeals to create a specific impression. The manipulator often doesn't raise red flags right away. Instead, they create confusion, a fog in your mind where it becomes difficult to tell what's real and what's distorted. They might do this through inconsistent behavior, vague language, or dramatic storytelling designed to tug at your sympathy. Over time, this leaves you doubting your instincts, second, guessing your own perceptions, and relying more on their version of reality than your own. This dynamic is especially effective because it doesn't look dangerous at first. In fact, manipulative people often appear helpful, warm, or insightful. They may frame their actions as being for your own good, while subtly undermining your independence, confidence, or clarity. You find yourself making excuses for them, giving them the benefit of the doubt, or even feeling guilty for questioning their intentions. And that's the whole point. They don't want to raise suspicion. They want to build dependency. As long as you remain confused or emotionally entangled, they stay in control. But here's the truth. This type of manipulation only works in the absence of awareness. The minute you start seeing patterns, their tendency to deflect responsibility, their strategic use of guilt, the way they twist your words or avoid direct answers, the illusion begins to crack. When you recognize these behaviors for what they are, the emotional fog starts to lift. You no longer feel disoriented. Instead, you feel a strange calm clarity, as if you've been looking at a puzzle for a long time and suddenly see how the pieces fit together. And this moment of realization, this psychological click, is extremely powerful. Because the manipulator's strength didn't come from actual authority or intelligence, it came from your uncertainty. The moment you figure them out, they can sense the shift. You might not say anything. You might not confront them directly, but something in your body language changes, in the way you speak to them, in the way you stop asking for their approval. They feel it immediately. It threatens their control. Interestingly, what often follows is a visible reaction on their part. Some manipulators respond with defensiveness or anger, trying to regain control by provoking guilt or portraying you as the aggressor. Others go silent, hoping that withdrawal will draw you back into the dynamic. Some may even try to bomb you, suddenly becoming kind, attentive, or overly apologetic in an effort to reset the emotional hook. These reactions aren't sincere, they are tactical, and when you see them for what they are, you can remain grounded instead of being pulled back in. This entire experience shows that manipulative people are not invincible or mysterious, they are predictable. They follow a psychological script because it has worked for them in the past. Their tactics rely on your emotional availability, your empathy, your desire to be seen as fair or kind. But once you recognize the script, you no longer respond to it the same way. You begin to set quiet boundaries, you detach emotionally, you stop over-explaining or trying to prove yourself, and this is the moment they begin to lose power over you, not because you confronted them with rage, but because you became unplayable. This shift can be both liberating and unsettling. It forces you to rethink not just your relationship with that one person, but your entire approach to communication and trust. You start asking deeper questions. Why did I ignore the early signs? What made me susceptible to their tactics? Where else in my life am I tolerating confusion disguised as connection? These questions are not signs of failure, they are signs of growth. They show that your awareness is expanding, that you are developing discernment, and that you are becoming more fluent in the language of emotional dynamics. One of the most profound lessons here is that you don't need to react loudly or dramatically to regain your power. You just need to see clearly. In fact, the quieter your clarity, the more destabilizing it becomes for the manipulator, because they can't argue with what you don't say. They can't spin a narrative if you don't engage. Silence combined with insight becomes your strongest form of protection. It removes the fuel from their strategy. It leaves them exposed, not because you attacked them, but because their behavior no longer has a place to hide. And yes, they often feel stupid when you figure them out, not because you've humiliated them, but because they've lost the game they thought they were playing in secret. The entire manipulation depended on staying hidden. Your clarity, your ability to name what's happening, ruins the structure they carefully built. In that moment, they are forced to confront the reality that their tactics are not as sophisticated or undetectable as they believe. It's a quiet defeat, but a meaningful one. That's why developing this level of awareness is not just about protecting yourself from others. It's about refining your inner world. When you learn to spot manipulation, you also learn to trust your instincts more deeply. You learn to observe behavior patterns rather than relying solely on words. You become emotionally self-sufficient, less reactive, and more deliberate in your interactions. This isn't about becoming cold or suspicious. It's about becoming clear. Ultimately, the people who rely on manipulation do not flourish in environments where clarity, boundaries, and emotional intelligence are the norm. They feel uncomfortable, exposed, and ineffective. And that's exactly where you want to be, not to dominate them, but to elevate yourself above their level of dysfunction. By choosing awareness over confusion, you not only protect your mental space, you grow into someone who others cannot easily deceive. Awareness is not just a concept, it's a life skill, one of the most valuable forms of personal power you can develop. In a world where manipulation often hides behind charm, intelligence, and emotional appeal, being aware of how people operate becomes your first and strongest line of defense. It's what protects your boundaries, maintains your peace, and gives you control over your responses. But this kind of awareness isn't something you stumble upon by accident. It's something you cultivate deliberately through emotional intelligence, self-reflection, and observation. Emotional intelligence is at the heart of this process. It's not just about understanding others, it's about being deeply attuned to your own emotional reactions, triggers, and instincts. When someone says something that makes you feel guilty, anxious, or overly responsible, stop and examine it. Ask yourself, why did that statement affect me so strongly? Is this a real problem, or am I being pulled into someone else's narrative? Developing this kind of inner dialogue helps you filter out emotional manipulation before it has a chance to take root. One of the most underestimated aspects of emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize patterns in behavior. Manipulative people rarely act randomly. Their behavior tends to follow predictable cycles: charm, confusion, guilt, withdrawal, then re-engagement. They might compliment you excessively, then suddenly criticize or distance themselves. They might share vulnerable stories to gain your sympathy, only to later use your empathy against you. Once you start recognizing these patterns, you're less likely to fall for them. It's like watching a magician perform a trick once and being amazed, then seeing it again and realizing how it's done. The illusion breaks. You don't react the same way because you know what's behind the curtain. Another critical element of awareness is the practice of slowing down. Manipulation often relies on pressure, emotional urgency, guilt trips, or sudden demands for decisions. When you slow down your reactions, you take back control of the pace. You give yourself time to think, to ask questions, and to notice how the interaction is making you feel. People who aim to control others dislike this pause. It disrupts their strategy. But for you, this pause becomes a moment of clarity, a small act of resistance that signals you're not being pulled into someone else's emotional current. You'll notice, too, that when you become more aware, your need for external validation decreases. This is powerful because manipulators often prey on the human desire to be liked, accepted, or seen as good. When you shift your focus inward, valuing your peace over people pleasing, you become harder to guilt, flatter, or provoke. You realize that you don't need to prove your worth in every conversation. You don't need to explain yourself endlessly or absorb responsibility for someone else's emotions. This inner stability makes you emotionally unattractive to manipulators because they can no longer feed off your reactions. Awareness also teaches you to listen differently, not just to what people say, but how they say it, and what they consistently do. Pay attention to inconsistencies. If someone says they value honesty, but avoids accountability, that's a gap worth noting. If they apologize with words but show no change in behavior, that's not growth, it's maintenance of the status quo. People reveal themselves over time, not just through their stories, but through their patterns. Your awareness allows you to connect those dots, to move beyond surface impressions and into deeper understanding. This doesn't mean becoming cynical or distrusting of everyone. It means becoming discerning. It means being able to say, I can see what's happening here, and I choose not to participate in it. Discernment is quiet. It doesn't require confrontation or dramatic exits. Often, it's expressed through subtle shifts, setting boundaries, reducing emotional availability, or removing yourself from certain dynamics altogether. These are not acts of hostility. They are acts of self-respect. And the more you practice them, the more naturally they become part of your communication style. What's interesting is how people respond when they sense that you've become aware. The ones with good intentions usually feel relieved. They value your clarity, they adjust their behavior, and communication becomes healthier. But the ones who were relying on your confusion, they feel threatened. They may accuse you of changing, becoming distant, or acting superior. That's because your awareness exposes their behavior, not always publicly, but internally. It disrupts the role they were playing in your life and forces them to either evolve or retreat. And this is where you begin to see the power of emotional awareness, not as a defensive mechanism, but as a tool for empowerment. It allows you to navigate relationships with wisdom rather than fear. It teaches you to observe without absorbing. You can remain kind without being naive. You can be compassionate without being exploited. You start asking better questions, not just about others, but about yourself. What does this interaction teach me about my own boundaries? Why did I tolerate that behavior before? How can I respond differently next time? These questions guide your growth. Most importantly, awareness creates emotional freedom. When you can recognize manipulation, you no longer carry the emotional weight of it. You don't have to internalize the blame, the confusion, or the shame that manipulators often project. You can return that energy to its source and walk away lighter, clearer, more centered. You start to trust yourself, not because you know everything, but because you've learned how to observe and reflect before reacting. That kind of inner trust becomes your emotional compass, and once you develop it, no one can take it away from you. The beauty of this process is that it doesn't require permission. You don't need to wait for someone to change in order to become more aware. You can start today by paying attention, asking questions, and choosing clarity over chaos. Every time you do, you're not just protecting yourself from manipulation, you're building a life based on truth, intention, and self-respect, and in that space, manipulation cannot thrive. There is a very specific moment in human interaction that shifts everything, when you silently, internally, or calmly realize that someone has been manipulating, deceiving, or emotionally managing you. It's not a loud moment, it's not filled with drama, it's a quiet click in your mind, a realization that what seemed confusing is now very clear. This is the moment of exposure, not for you, but for them. Because you've finally connected the dots, and in doing so, you've shattered the illusion they were relying on to maintain control. This moment often feels incredibly empowering to the person who has been manipulated. It's like waking up from a dream where the rules never made sense and suddenly seeing everything for what it really is. Patterns you once ignored become obvious. Words they spoke now sound rehearsed. Their inconsistencies, once brushed off as stress or moodiness, appear as clear signs of manipulation. And in that moment, you no longer feel like the confused one in the relationship. You become the observer, not the participant. You stop trying to fix or explain anything. You see the game and you choose to stop playing it. For the manipulator, however, this is a moment of exposure and often embarrassment. They sense the shift even before you say anything. They notice the pause in your usual reactions, the lack of emotional investment, the change in your facial expression or tone. You're no longer feeding the dynamic, you're no longer dancing to the rhythm they set. That recognition is deeply unsettling for them because they realize their strategy has failed. What they counted on, your confusion, your self-doubt, your emotional involvement, has been taken away, and what remains is your clarity. And clarity, to someone who thrives on misdirection, is like a spotlight they never asked for. It's important to understand that this feeling of exposure doesn't necessarily come from public humiliation. It's not that you've called them out in front of a crowd or made a scene. It's much subtler than that. The embarrassment they feel comes from losing their grip. It's the internal panic that sets in when someone they thought they could control has outgrown the manipulation. They feel foolish not because you yelled at them, but because you saw them and chose to step away. In many cases, that silent recognition is far more powerful than confrontation. You might notice them try to recover their control quickly. Some will attempt to re-engage you emotionally by acting hurt or shocked. They might ask why you're being different or accuse you of being cold or distant. These are not true questions. They are fishing expeditions to find out how much you've figured out and whether they can still access your emotions. Others might become defensive or angry, trying to shift the focus onto your behavior so they don't have to face the discomfort of being exposed. They may attempt to provoke guilt, suggesting you've misinterpreted everything or are overreacting. These reactions are meant to confuse you again, to throw you off balance and make you question your realization. But when you remain steady, calm, and unmoved, the manipulator experiences a kind of psychological disempowerment. You've stepped outside their script, you're no longer responding to the cues they've designed. And because their identity was partially built on being able to influence or dominate emotionally, your lack of reaction feels like rejection, not just of their behavior, but of the image they tried to construct for themselves. They begin to feel exposed even if you haven't said a word. Sometimes this realization will drive them to retreat. They might ghost you, act indifferent, or pretend they were never invested to begin with. This, again, is a defense mechanism. If they can't control the narrative with you anymore, they try to preserve their ego by exiting first. But even in that exit, the discomfort remains, because they know they didn't walk away with power, they lost it. They know they didn't confuse you. You figured them out, and that loss of control stings. The irony is that most manipulators don't see themselves as weak or insecure. Many of them operate from a place of superiority, believing they're smarter or more emotionally savvy than others. That's why being figured out feels like a personal blow. It contradicts the internal story they've told themselves, that they are always a step ahead, that they can manage outcomes, that people don't catch on. When you do catch on, it's not just their behavior that's revealed, it's their own vulnerability. It shows that the act they've been putting on isn't as seamless as they thought. For you, recognizing this moment is crucial because it confirms the strength of your discernment. You've not only identified the behavior, but you've detached from it without drama, and that emotional detachment is what makes it so impactful. You didn't fight them, you outgrew them. That is something they cannot easily dismiss. It leaves them alone with their behavior, their failed manipulation, and their now fragile sense of control. It's also important to note that you don't need to explain yourself in these moments. Often, the most powerful thing you can do is quietly reclaim your emotional distance and maintain your boundaries without providing the manipulator with more material to twist. The truth is, once you've seen through someone's manipulation, there's nothing they can say that will unsee it for you. You don't owe them a debate or a detailed explanation. Your clarity is enough. Your silence speaks volumes. Over time, you'll notice how these moments change you. You begin to trust your inner signals more deeply. You become quicker at spotting red flags and more willing to walk away from people who operate from dishonesty or emotional control. The more you practice this, the less tolerance you have for manipulation and the less it shows up in your life. That is the long-term power of recognizing when you've figured someone out. Not only do they feel exposed in that moment, but you evolve in a way that prevents the cycle from repeating. And that is the real lesson. You're not just protecting yourself from one manipulator. You're becoming someone who moves through life with clarity, strength, and emotional self-respect. You're choosing truth over confusion, peace over performance, and awareness over emotional chaos. That evolution makes you someone who can no longer be controlled through deception, and when they realize that, they feel it. They feel seen, disarmed, and often deeply embarrassed because the moment you figured them out, the game ended and they lost. There is a deep and lasting kind of freedom that comes when you no longer feel the need to engage with manipulative people. But to reach that point, you must go through an internal transformation, one that shifts your mindset from emotional reaction to intentional detachment. This doesn't mean you become emotionally numb or stop caring about people. It means you develop the wisdom to know who is deserving of your energy and who is simply trying to control it. Emotional detachment is not coldness, it is clarity with boundaries. And it is this detachment that allows you to move on quietly, gracefully, and completely free. When you recognize that someone has been using manipulation, whether through guilt, flattery, confusion, or gaslighting, the natural reaction might be to confront them, prove a point, or demand justice. That's a normal human impulse, but as your emotional maturity grows, you begin to realize that engaging in that confrontation often serves them more than it serves you. Manipulative people thrive in chaos. They want the backhand forth. They feed on emotional investment, even if it comes in the form of anger or frustration. When you stop participating, when you no longer provide reactions, they lose the very tool they were using to maintain influence over you. What makes emotional detachment so powerful is that it shifts the source of control back to you. You stop giving people the power to affect your mood, your sense of worth, or your decisions. You choose silence instead of argument, distance instead of drama, and self-respect instead of self-sacrifice. This isn't about being indifferent, it's about being discerning. You still feel things deeply, but you no longer allow those feelings to drag you into situations that rob you of peace. This level of control comes not from suppression, but from emotional discipline. Once you've figured someone out, once you've seen the patterns and recognized their tactics, you don't need to make a public declaration of it. In fact, the most impactful response is often the quietest one. It's when you stop explaining, stop justifying, stop hoping for them to see your point. Instead, you simply shift your energy elsewhere. You put your attention back on yourself, on your own healing, growth, and goals. You stop orbiting around their approval or disapproval. That quiet withdrawal is often the most deafening message of all, and it's one that manipulative people find hardest to accept. What many don't understand is that the strength in detachment doesn't come from pretending not to care. It comes from choosing not to be controlled by the care. You can still acknowledge your disappointment, your hurt, or even your lingering affection. But you no longer let those emotions override your awareness. You no longer let your empathy be weaponized. You learn to feel deeply and act wisely. That's the essence of emotional freedom. This shift in behavior also reclaims your mental space. You no longer spend your nights replaying conversations, overanalyzing their words, or wondering if you were too harsh or too soft. You no longer live in a loop of mental conflict, trying to resolve what was never meant to be fair. Instead, your mind becomes quieter, clearer. You find yourself more present in your own life, more connected to people who value you, and more aligned with the version of yourself that no longer tolerates confusion disguised as affection. And what happens on the other side of this transformation is a sense of personal power that is calm, unshakable, and self-sourced. You realize that walking away without chaos doesn't make you weak, it makes you wise. You understand that not every battle is worth fighting, especially when the real victory is in protecting your energy. You stop explaining your choices to people who are never truly listening, and you stop shrinking yourself to avoid offending those who relied on your silence to maintain their comfort. For the person who once manipulated you, your detachment is disorienting. They were counting on your emotional investment. They expected you to fight for the relationship, to chase their approval, to defend yourself against their subtle accusations. When none of that happens, they begin to lose their sense of control. And it's not just about losing influence over you. It's about being faced with a version of you they no longer recognize. You've changed, you've grown, you've become someone who cannot be pulled back into the same cycle. This new version of you is not loud or defensive. It is simply unavailable for manipulation. You become emotionally unhookable. They might test this by reaching out, trying to provoke a response, or acting as if nothing happened. But you don't return to the old patterns. You don't feel the need to respond, to clarify, or to re-engage. You know the cost of reopening that door, and you value your peace too much to do it again. And in this space of detachment, something else beautiful happens. You create room for healthier connections. When you're no longer mentally and emotionally tied to people who confuse or control you, you begin to attract relationships that are grounded in mutual respect, honesty, and trust. You develop stronger boundaries, not as walls, but as filters that protect what you've worked so hard to rebuild. You no longer approach relationships with fear or desperation. You approach them with clarity because now you know the signs. Now you know yourself. The most important part of this journey is that you are no longer motivated by proving anything to anyone. You don't need closure from people who never gave you honesty. You don't need validation from those who were only ever invested in their own control. You close the chapter on your own terms, silently, firmly, and with grace, and that kind of ending is not only satisfying, it is empowering, because it shows that you didn't just survive the manipulation, you transcended it. And yes, when they eventually realize that you're not coming back, not engaging, not explaining, they will feel it. That silence, that peace, that emotional distance is the evidence that you figured them out. Not only did you see through the illusion, but you walked away from it and built something better for yourself. That's not just a loss for them, it's a mirror, one they can't control and one they often cannot bear to look into. The journey of recognizing manipulation and reclaiming your power is not about vengeance, confrontation, or proving anyone wrong. It's about evolution. It's about growing into a version of yourself that is more emotionally intelligent, more aware, and less available for anything that threatens your inner peace. When you figure them out, when you see through the strategies, the charm, the guilt trips, the confusion, it's not just a personal victory. It's a turning point, because once you see clearly, you can no longer be controlled in the same way. Those who manipulate, whether subtly or overtly, do so because they rely on your emotional unawareness. They need you to doubt yourself, to ignore your instincts, to prioritize their comfort over your clarity. But when you wake up to these dynamics, when you connect the dots and trust your observations, everything begins to shift. They feel exposed not because you told them off, but because you stopped playing the role they assigned you, and in that silence they hear the truth, louder than any confrontation could deliver. The strength lies not in reacting, but in detaching. Not in shouting, but in stepping back with intention and maturity. Emotional distance becomes your boundary, your protection, your power, and through that distance you become someone who no longer tolerates dysfunction disguised as connection. You become someone who chooses clarity over chaos, self-respect over approval, and peace over performance. Ultimately, they do feel stupid, not because you wanted to humiliate them, but because they miscalculated your growth. They underestimated your intelligence, your awareness, your resilience, and when you quietly walk away, calm, clear, and free, they are left to confront their own behavior in the mirror of your silence. That is the end of their control and the beginning of your transformation.